just say, that's it, either science is wrong or Torah is wrong. But as I said last week, the Rambam always wants us to see, if you haven't understood, you think there's a contradiction between science and Torah, it means you either didn't understand the science or didn't understand the Torah. Again, assuming you can apply that same principle to Torah modern science. I'll say a few things that I think are also worthwhile as introductions. There is a narrative that the more science has progressed, the more it's diverged from traditional religious thinking. That narrative, I think, goes back to the French Revolution, and it kind of has its test case proof where science was held up because of religion. And what's the test case proof? The kind of narrative of this is Copernicus, right? The Galileo controversy. Copernicus is the one who's discovered that really the right way to model the universe is the sun is the thing standing still and the earth is moving around it rather than the other way around. Heliocentric as opposed to geocentric. And that's kind of put forward as this great example of, as if, and we could bring hundreds of others. And there aren't hundreds of others. First, obviously, not every religion was involved in that controversy, but even there's the word, it's not the main story. In fact, there's another story which is worth knowing in terms of the scientific progress in the last few centuries. What we call modern science, classical physics, really goes to Isaac Newton. We're talking 17th century, right, 1666 really. And Newton himself wrote about a few topics. Almost all of his writings fall into 3 or 4 categories. Maths and physics is one. They were very intertwined in those days. Right, Newton's laws of physics really are good enough that an enormous amount of physics to this day can be run just working through Newton's laws. His mathematics, he and Leibniz both came up with the calculus and so on. He then wrote a lot about what seems to people like crazy alchemy, right, which is how you turn one substance into another. But it was basically attempts in those days to do chemistry. It was, it proved its assumptions proved false, but he wrote about that too. The third topic, or fourth, depends how you divide the maths and the physics. The next topic he wrote an enormous amount about, and this embarrasses people, and it's kind of like hidden away, but it occupied an enormous amount of his writings, was the Torah and the Jewish people. Newton was very, very fascinated. He was, I think he Hebraist himself. At that time, there were a lot of academics learning Hebrew, some even learning Gemara, learning Aramaic. Newton himself seems to have had quite a significant expertise, and he was very, very impressed by and moved by and motivated by Torah and the Jewish people. And one of the things that likely motivated, or certainly Newton believed he was playing a part of, is that the science given to the world up till that point was essentially Greek science. In essence, it was what the Greeks had come up with, which shows how brilliant the Greeks were, by the way. For about nearly 2,000 years, science only progressed in details, but not in its fundamental structure, from things the Greeks had given us. Newton was bothered because, amongst other things, and again, I'm not enough a historian of Newton to know if this is precisely the thought process, but amongst other things, what Newton left us with what the Greeks left us with is a multiple world. There's lots of things happening, lots of forces and laws, and Bereshit chapter 1 tells us everything comes from one God. So you'd expect there to be more unity. By the way, Newton was not the only one. There was a great philosopher of modern science called Francis Bacon, and he wrote a series here, I think it's called the Nova Morgana, the Instauratio Magna, and in there he basically comes up with the philosophical underpinnings, and he spends very, very little time, more or less zero time, worrying about the church. His main thing he has to fight against is people who are so convinced that the Greeks are right. How can we progress inside? Like, he has to explain the Greeks are wrong, and he really goes to town to explain this, and argues there must be more unity. The hypothesis that the universe should be more unified than we've got so far is, if you think about it, a monotheistic hypothesis, inspired by things like the Torah, because it's not a priori obvious the universe has to settle towards some grand unification principle or more and more deep unity, right? In theory, it could be very messy. Well, why shouldn't it be? If you believe in lots of gods, it could be lots of forces. If you believe in no gods, it could be a real mess. If you believe in one God in the biblical sense, that one God creates the light and the dark and the sun and the moon and all the different forces and everything, right, then you would be surprised if the universe doesn't look more unified when you study it. So that was a lot of the driving force in the 17th century to look at science in a completely different way, and it proved to be the most incredibly successful endeavor humanity's ever done in terms of a scientific endeavor, the search for deeper unity. You know, when Newton, in the apocryphal story that an apple fell on his head, right? Okay, that story is almost for sure not true. But what is almost for sure true, John has passed some chairs to the back of what is almost for sure true is that at some point Newton came to the realization that the same force that makes an apple that detaches from a tree have to hit planet Earth is the same force that keeps the moon in orbit around planet Earth. And you know, that unification principle, amongst all other laws, is very powerful. So I'm laying that down as an important principle. The narrative that the more science advances, the more it peels away from religion, or the more it jettisons religious thinking, the more it can free itself to progress, is not necessarily consonant with the way science has happened to have gone in the last few centuries. In more detail, even little, and then I'll get to the actual core topic. In more detail, you know, we're familiar with the idea that if you would have gone back, let's say 130 years, let's say, end of the 19th century, very beginning of the 20th century, and asked people how old is the universe, right? What would the standard answer have been?
It's eternal.
Well, there have been two standard answers. There might have been those of Christian faith might have answered some kind of biblical answer, but the standard answer in physics would have been eternal. Right? Now, whether that's logically possible, that's a whole different story. Can you really have an infinite past? I think there's a significant problem with that. But a lot of people thought that way. And what most people aren't aware, and then the second model, which people would have got mostly from faith-based thinking, is several thousand years ago, depends on how they would have mapped the calendar, say 5,500, 6,000 years ago, you would have had God populated with various entities. And almost overlooked is the Ramban's introduction to Bereshis, right? Nachmanides' introduction, where he tells us that the whole universe and everything in it was a nekuda haskana, a little tiny little dot, right? And he describes in different places what this dot was. That's the only thing, and he explains that that's from the actual text itself. It's not just from the Kabbalistic tradition which he had, but it's actually from the fact that the verb bara, which is the biblical verb for creation of something from nothing, rarely occurs in the creation story. The primary verbs, well, outside God speaking is the most prevalent verb, but in terms of action verbs, it's asiya and yetzira. The word bariah, creation of something from nothing, rarely occurs. It occurs at the beginning, it occurs at the Tani Nimagadolim, these great monsters, reptiles, whatever they are, and it occurs at with the soul of man. But in the main actual creations, you really only have that bara Elokim, the beginning Bereshit, God creates. And the Ramban says what that means is that there was a creation. Then he has the tradition that it's this tiny little dot, and which presumably means this dot has to stretch or expand to produce all of our universe. And elsewhere he used the language of dak moed, it's very thin, and aim by mamash, it lacks substance. And if you fast forward to today, more or less all physicists will agree with you that there was a point in the past where the universe was incredibly tiny. Some would say it literally goes to the point where it's zero at some point, and that's Big Bang cosmology, and others would say something else, an eptichronic universe, different other possibilities. But this idea, this is the point. You fast forward 130 years, and everybody's talking in the language that the Ramban was saying, and this is not like we're reading into the Ramban. He says this black and white as one of the two primary commentaries on the Torah. The first to draw all the different traditions together, including Kabbalah, and interpreting the text, is telling you very uncontroversially within Jewish sources that's how creation happened. And that certainly is something which science has converged towards. So it's not a simple story of as science jettisons faith, or it moves further away. For the most part, it's moving closer together. But the age of the universe, therefore, is our major piece here. Now let me talk about the different types of approaches, some of which you'll have heard, many of which you might have heard, but let me just talk them through a little bit. So one approach can say like this. I'm going to go from kind of the more traditional, less scientific, to in the other direction, to the more scientific, maybe not as obviously traditional, but we'll go through each of them as follows. And all of them taking the Torah seriously and science seriously in different ways. The one that, if you like, takes science the least seriously, but still takes it to a large degree seriously, is one you'll hear being said and there are quite a lot of rabbis who take approach to this, which is God could have built a universe looking older than it really is. What are they saying? They're saying to you that science is telling you the truth, meaning all a scientist can tell you is what the effects we perceive are and what is the most best, simplest, neatest model if you projected it backwards, right? That's what science studies. So if we build a virtual world right now, and the virtual world is as real as this one, and you go digging around it, it may have a history. That's the basic principle. And you'll hear people say that Rabbi David Gottlieb has a bit more sophisticated defense of this view. That view exists out there, and you can't disprove it. You'd have to have a very strong reason to believe the Torah, because you're asking us to take the scientific model as a fair model, but why would God plant this complicated model of a very long past with loads and loads of species that don't exist nowadays? Okay, that's a theological question. You can go down that route. That is a fair number of people like to just say that. We take the Torah in its literal form. Everything it tells about the dating is accurate. Science is telling us the information we have today. If you had to give a best model for it, it would be this ancient thing. Fine, God could create a world that looks that way, and so on. That's one. I'm not going to spend too long on it because it's straightforward. You either like a view like that or you don't like a view like that, is what it is. A second view, which is not a million miles dissimilar, but gives more credence to more realism, I should say, about the scientific picture, is the following. And here we begin an important piece of information that's going to be relevant to all the other approaches as well, which is that we begin the Jewish New Year when? On Rosh Hashanah, right? We're then in very soon, next week. Okay, when Rosh Hashanah comes along, what does Rosh Hashanah commemorate? What was the first Rosh Hashanah? Yeah, not when the universe, when Adam, when man is created, the sixth day of creation. Up till the point man is created is separate from the rest of the calendar. Now, is that significant? Is 5 and a bit days doesn't really give you billions of years. But here's where it starts to get more and more interesting. First, if you look in the Gemara in Chagiga, I'm not going to go through the sugya now, but the Gemara is a fascinating discussion about how if you ask about the Yomim, the days that were before you, and the Gemara says you're not allowed to ask about what was before the world, and you might think that includes the days of creation as well, and no, you can as well. But the days of creation, therefore, an intermediary state. It's clear from the Gemara, before what is called before us and where we are now. There is something very different about those days of creation. I'll put it to you slightly differently as well. There is an interesting machlokas, an interesting debate in the Torah commentaries and Jewish philosophers and Kabbalists and so on. What and where and when is the Garden of Eden? Is Gan Eden, right? It's clearly a very important story. It's there at the beginning of the Torah. It's the Torah zooming into the sixth day of creation. And there's first there's a debate if you could geographically even locate it on Earth, because the problem is there's 4 rivers that come out of Eden, but they don't meet on Earth. The simple way of reading the Torah, that they don't meet. So where is it? It's the whole Middle East and Africa, and there's machlokas, different. But as it says this, there's different views. And then there's a debate, is the Garden of Eden a physical place or not? The Ramban famously tells us there's a higher Gan Eden, and Gan Eden Elyon, some spiritual inner core of creation, and there's a Gan Eden Tachton, a lower Gan Eden, lower Garden of Eden. Now the Ramchal in the Das Tavunas, again we're talking hundreds of years before modern science, this is not a rabbi doing apologetics because of modern physics. This is an extremely mainstream source, tells us that actually the garden, even the lower Garden of Eden, the so-called physical Garden of Eden, is not physical the way we would describe something physical nowadays. And he says that within the human you have what you call the soul and the body, right? So whatever those are exactly, but somewhere in the flow between physicality up to consciousness, up to something much deeper, you've got different parts of us. And there's a gap between them, if you like. One's more spiritual, one's less. But if you take that gap and you project it up, everything we call body is like a vessel for the soul, which is like the light. But just because something is a light, that too can be a vessel to a light higher than it. Okay? So what we call the soul, in fact, is a body to a level even higher. It's a relative term, what's body and what's soul. And in the Garden of Eden, man was on the higher level. That is to say, what we would call our soul would have been called a body in the Garden of Eden. And there are numerous sources that support this in different ways. The Torah itself throws a gigantic indicator in that only when Adam is ejected from the garden does he get what's called kosnos or garments of skin. Now you could read that as leather clothing, right? But the literal meaning of the Torah is garments of skin. This that we call protoplasm, or the flesh that we have, this is what comes out of the garden. Before that point, there is no physical, what we would call a physical body. So Adam is on this level, if you like. Because of the sin, he's ejected downwards into space-time, into the world as we understand it, where now what was called a body is the soul, and you now have a physical outer layer. Had Adam not sinned, he would actually shifted up to the kind of final layer they were meant to go. He could go in two directions. What he would have called the soul would have been the body to the final layer. And therefore, other hints to this, by the way, are even the name Garden of Eden. Right, I've said this in a lot of talks, it's very important to know this. The Hebrew word Eden, I think we said it last week even, is a word for time. Right, the word Zaman does not appear in Torah. It appears in Tanakh, but not in Torah. Eden is one of the primary temporal words of Torah. When Avraham is standing before God and he wants to use a temporal word, he is still standing before God. In Parashat Vayera it says, Odenu omid lifnei Hashem. Odenu, right? You see it throughout Torah and throughout the book of Koheles, which does use the word Zman. There it talks about people who have not yet been born. It's a temporal word, Asher Edan Lo Haya, in the 4th chapter. Right? So you'll see this, even in modern Hebrew, it's preserved in words like Odenu, Adayan, these are time. So it's a garden of time. It's not a place in space and time. It is all of space and time, or at least all of time, from a completely different perspective. Now, there's a lot of important, relevant details to this, but I want to get us back in, because this is where, what that seems to imply is something like this. That until the point where Adam is ejected from the Garden of Eden, and maybe even later than that point, we are not measuring things the way we measure them inside space-time. I'll give you one analogy for thinking about this. Suppose somewhere in the not very distant future, a bunch of computer scientists and physicists and cosmologists and everyone gets together in a room and they decide to build a simulated universe pretty similar to our own. So they run something like a Big Bang and they're running this very sophisticated simulation of it. And after the first day, it's successfully produced space. It didn't collapse back on its own gravity. Maybe there's some particles, maybe there's some radiation, electromagnetic radiation, or something equivalent. And each day they retune it a little bit. You know, eventually you get stars start to form, and then eventually you get stars that can produce planets, and all these kind of things are happening. Eventually you get planets with the right conditions for life, and after a few days of fiddling around with this universe, you start to get life forming, and you're doing all these little adjustments and stuff is happening. And eventually you get this, when you can run the model, and intelligent life emerges at some point. Right? You know. And as you do all of this, you get to the point where after a few days of playing around with this universe, you've now got a sophisticated species that's capable of understanding, let's say, the English language or something like that. They're humanoid or humans or something a bit like us. And it's time to send a scientist inside to meet these people. And okay, one of you gets chosen, and you put on the simulated suit and whatever it is, and boom, you wake up and you're inside this universe. And you're walking around and talking to people, and you get somebody and introduce yourself, hi, I'm whatever, and they say hello back, and you can all talk to each other. And you ask them the question, you say, how old are you? And they say, I'm 25 years old. And you look at them with a frown and go, how can you be 25 years old? This universe didn't exist 25 years ago. And they go, what are you talking about? I've been here 25 years, and my grandparents are around. I can show you the history of this place. It's millions of years old, it's billions of years old, right? And here's our data, here's our evidence, here's everything. But I could show you a camera on my phone. I was filming you guys, you didn't exist till a week ago. Who's right? You're both right. You're just talking from very, very different perspectives. One is talking about is measuring the days of creation from the creation world in which all the space and time of this universe is being created. And then inside this, there's a whole different measure of time. Now you measure from its own universal perspective, and you go back and you measure something very different. You're not arguing. You're not contradicting each other. You think you are, because you think you're using the same units to measure the same things. So what this would suggest, when Adam is ejected from Gan Eden, that event happens 5,785 years ago. when the soul of Adam shatters from being one, and we'll talk about this maybe another time, into billions of fragments, and they're distributed across space-time, and the 0.578 years ago, roughly, is the beginning, just before the beginning of what we call today civilization, which means sophisticated, socially complex urbanization and writing and all this kind of stuff. That's the point at which we're then measuring the next 5 years on Earth, right? Plus the days of creation, where what was relevant then is what's being built. What's relevant, the story of humanity with a soul and with ability to connect to God is 5, 7, 8 years old. And then we can, within this universe, try to measure time backwards and go through billions of years. They're not contradicting each other. Everything the Torah says and everything Chazal say is exactly right, and everything the scientists are saying is not even talking about the same subject matter. They can also be exactly right. So on this view, science and Torah don't contradict because they're not discussing the same thing. There's an illusion they're discussing the same thing, but there's no reason to assume they are. Then you have other views, right? So that's view 1 and view 2. View 3, it starts to be those who want to reconcile the creation chapter with events in science. Right? In the Orthodox Jewish world, there are 2 people who stand out to having made a tremendous effort at doing this, or written a lot about it. One is Natan Aviezer, and one is Gerald Schroeder. I don't know if he still teaches here, he used to. And they both go about it in slightly different ways, and they're not the only ones. In the non-Jewish world, there's also people who've done this. There's, I think, a scientist in Cambridge, I believe, has written a book on this. And what they both notice is that the order of creation, with one notable exception, maps pretty accurately the same story that science tells us. The time is the problem, but the order maps very precisely. The beginning, the first thing you'd have of the description is light, right? The decoupling of light and dark. Then you start to get already the planets are formed at that point, and then how planet Earth starts to move is right from the beginning. Plant life forms very, very quickly, or early life that we would call plant life, and then life emerges in the sea, and then you get flying insects, if you call oaf, which literally means a flying thing could include an insect. Then eventually, when it swarms, eventually comes on land, and then humans come. So it's all in the right order. The problem is the 4th day. The sun and moon don't appear until the 4th day. But in the Jewish tradition, that's not really a problem, because we believe in the oral Torah as well, and the Gemara is very clear that everything was created on the 1st day. The sun was already there on the 1st day, it just was only revealed on the 4th day. And it's possible because the change in atmospheric conditions, it became visible only on the 4th day. Again, I forget his name, but the scientist, I think he's in Cambridge, he has a whole different hypothesis, but we're going with so Schroeder and Aviezer, we're going with Schroeder and Aviezer, who are modeling on the Talmudic picture and the Torah's picture. And they both say, well, if the order is right, then, and your problem's time, then how do we work with that? And Natan Aviezer's approach is to say that the word yom in Hebrew does not have to mean a day. On that point, he's correct, by the way, because you see in the Torah, what else does yom mean? Usually in a plural form, yamim means years. It can relate to Yovel cycles. It can relate to 1,000 years. Ki elef shana b'necha ki yom esmol. It says in the book of Psalms, 1,000 years is a yom in your eyes. So lots of units of time, and it could be any unit of time, and his hypothesis is that the Torah, it just means yom. Now, the natural thing to assume is a day, because that's the most prevalent use of the word yom, and that's the most common cycle of time you experience. But the Torah doesn't have to be stuck with 24-hour periods of time. This is what he argues. And why? So why would the Torah say that? Because the Torah is not a book of science. The Torah is there to give you information that guides you in life, and you need to know creation takes place in 6 cycles, and so on, and that's got to have all sorts of lessons to it, and Rashi draws out some, and others draw out others, and that's what he says. There are those who don't like that view, not least because the Ramban himself says they are 24-hour periods. Okay, you don't have to follow everything a Rishon says, but you don't really want to ideally go against. Gerald Schroeder has a different approach. This is the 4th approach now, and he says that they could be 24 hours and billions of years. And his argument is that we now know through Einstein that time doesn't have there's no specific single flow of time in the universe. There is no one rate that time moves, right? You can be measuring 1 minute on Earth, and somebody in the other part of the universe measures 20 minutes, and somebody else measures 3 seconds. Time is flowing differently all over the universe, depending on things like acceleration and gravity. you'll come up with a different clocking of time. And he talks about the fact that many scientists like the idea of talking about there is one cosmological clock, and that's the microwave background radiation. And he does a whole bunch of actually calculations you can find in a physics book. I once did this. I once did a course with the Open University in cosmology just to check this out. And he was right, is that at least it was back then, is that the level to which the microwave background radiation has been stretched is a factor of a million times. Practically speaking, what that means is if you were looking at the beginning of space-time looking forward, and you saw an event one day later, when you look now back, the gap between the beginning and end of that day will be a million days. And Schroeder does a calculation. If you look at 14 million years backwards and look at it, divide it by a million, you end up with about 5 days, of 5 and a bit days of creation. So he wants to say, so you could literally say the days of creation exactly is talking about from the beginning of the universe looking forward, and we zoom in on Earth from the creation of man, of Adam, at the first Rosh Hashanah, right, 5,780 years ago. And again, that won't be the same as a Homo sapien, but it's something, a level within humanity we'd call Adam. And then he in his book, it's called Science of God, I think. Again, the physics will be slightly out of date now, it's like 30 years old. But the basic principle, that's his model, and he goes through a lot of details of that. So you've basically got at least 4 plausible accounts of this. Let's go over them again. And by the way, they don't all contradict each other. You could have more than one of them be true. One is to say God can make a universe look older than it is. 2 is to say that there could be a description of the programmatic structures of creation, as the rabbis in Chazal seem to be giving us, that the days of creation are not inside the universe, they're primarily describing outside. Those who like it al pi Kabbalah will understand that we're talking about different stages of the descent of the light of God, and we call them days of creation. And we only start joining the Earth calendar 5,785 years ago. But the days of creation are not being described inside the Earth calendar at all. Aviezer and Schroeder, Aviezer wants to say, no, it could even be relating to inside the universe, as long as the word yom doesn't have to be a day, and biblically speaking, it doesn't have to be a day, and therefore they're eras. And Schroeder says they actually are the same time, just from 2 different perspectives. Okay, so that's your basic outline. Now, could the last 2, either of them fit into the verse? Yeah, because what happens in the inner spiritual structures could have a map into the world. Even if you believe the primary meaning of Torah is days of creation are outside of, or generating the space-time we live in, and therefore not the sort of things you'd measure inside, there's a concept of ishtalshlus. As things flow down, they leave maps and imprints. So there may well still be an imprint in the physical universe that parallels that process. Yeah?
Do you mind if I ask your view on this?
My own view is I don't know. You know, I'm not. We don't have nevuah prophecy on it. We don't have an explicit thing in Chazal on it. I'm relatively certain the second approach is true. Meaning, I think if you just study the text like the Ramchal, and certainly according to Kabbalah, certainly, or my limited understanding of it, you would certainly think that the way you read the creation chapter is it's not describing the events inside space-time, but they do impact space-time. That's clear in Rashi, by the way. Rashi himself, who's not explicitly quoting, he doesn't quote anything from Kabbalah, right? He quotes it from the regular explicit Chazals in the Midrashim. He says that the whole 7 days of creation is occurring in the mind of God. That's why he uses the name Elokim, God, which usually refers to strict justice rather than using the name Hashem. That appears only in the next chapter. And Rashi says, Mitchila ola b'machshav, in the beginning it arose in God's mind. We have to get to what those words mean. To create the world with pure justice, saw it couldn't work, and then partnered it with mercy. Now, that doesn't mean, I don't think Rashi means that God was sitting there thinking, let me think about this, let me change my mind. No. He's saying he creates a prototype of creation in a level we would call the mind of God, as it would occur in its perfect idealized state, where man emerges in this world and through justice earns their keep. Then it's projected into this world, but in the real world, humans are going to come out, and there you need to give time, you need to have mercy married with it. And therefore Rashi would often refer back to something in the days of creation and say, this is why something like this is on earth. In other words, he sees it's a layer that's a part of the layers of reality that's projected into our world, right, and impacts things in our world, but is not, it is a different plane to this world. So you don't even need to go into the Kabbalah together. So I think number 2 is a very accurate way to read Gemaras and Ramchal and others, and you know, whether one of these other 2 is also accurate, I'd be a little reluctant to say, because I don't have enough expertise in physics, and I don't think physics has finished saying what it's going to say about the universe either. Right? Remember, we could be one revolution away from a very different set of laws of physics. One thing you have to bear in mind in the background of all of this is that up till the year 1905, it seemed that classical physics was so amazing that there was only, I think it was Michelson who said there's only two things left to figure out: the issues with the speed of light and the issues with some of these quantum processes. And those two little issues turn physics inside out. For example, consciousness is not an issue as solved in science. It could be that will invert the whole of reality and everything only exists in conscious minds, and everything will start to mean different things. So I was a little nervous to settle on a reconciliation of science and Torah when the science itself is not necessarily finished telling its story, and also we don't have a strong enough old tradition to be really confident about it. Nevertheless, I would definitely say both what Schroeder and Aviezer say are interesting. Very interesting and very plausible. Right. Okay, what was the second? Yeah.
I was asking about the free will.
Okay, so I had a similar question last week. Right. So the question here is, what's the point of the end of history when there is no free will? Right. What's the point of having a Messianic era or world to come where you have no free will at all? And the short answer is that's exactly the point. The goal of the world is not that we have free will. Free will is the critical means to achieve the goal that God has in the world. The goal of creation is God sharing creation, sharing of his own essence with other, who can, we might use words that are almost cheap, let's say pleasure, fulfillment, something God wants to give. That's the classical sort of, both in the philosophical works like Rabbi Sajigan's work, Sajigan's Emunas V'Deos, and also in the Kabbalistic tradition, both from different angles come to the same point that ultimately God desired to give, not needed to give, but desired to give the gift. Why doesn't God just create these beings in a gift state as recipients of good? So the line that's used that I think is misunderstood, the Ramchal used this line, he says in the Hamad, the Chisufa, it's the bread of shame. People don't like to receive, they like to earn things. So you could say, well, fine, why doesn't God create us with a different psychology? Right? But the answer, I think, is that it's not really saying that, it's saying something subtly different. You don't exist if you can't make choices. It's like I spoke about last week, bless you. I spoke about last week that one of the very helpful metaphors for thinking about creation, God, the relationship between creator and creation, is us thinking something into existence. But when we think another being into existence, that being has no awareness of itself. What we can't do is give it a space to think about itself, because to the extent to which we think it, we fill it. And to the extent to which we withdraw and let it have space, it stops existing. The miracle of creation is that God can somehow build this thing poised between existence and non-existence so that it exists but can feel itself. But that's like sort of suspended and has to land one way or the other. Now, the extent to which that being the extent to which God just fills that being, it is blasted out of existence. The extent to which the being invites God in, so to speak, even though when God's light fills it, it will lose its ability to have free will, it will always have a consciousness because it always has a memory of a self that invited God in. So free will is the thing that allows the self to exist and the thing that will allow the self to be eternal in the state when it's in total relationship with God, with its creator.
So therefore, in the afterlife, it still has like that memory from before?
Exactly. That is all it has, actually. Afterlife is not, I remember Moshe Shapiro saying this, it's not you get up out of, even the resurrection of the dead, it's not you get up out of a grave and walk around. What is resurrected is every moment and every choice you ever made. Right? So, it's not really, afterlife, according to most opinions, it's the reconstruction of mankind as a single soul, and it's like we're back in the Garden of Eden. So, okay, we don't need to get too deep into that particular point. But the key is this: the goal of creation is when we're full of the light of God. We say, Mala Aretz Deos Hashem, the whole world is just full of the connection to God. That's literally, the word Deo means knowledge, but it literally means connection, right? It's completely connected to God. That's what creation is for. That can't happen without a phase where we have the choice to invite God in or to throw God out. To choose to embrace the thing thinking us into existence and have that infinite light forever, or to reject it and choose non-existence and not exist forever. That's the choice we get to. Now, why does the Ramchal talk about bread of shame? Because what God built into creation is an emotional parallel to that. You see, every time we get something free, it feels like non-existence. And it feels like, and that's humiliation, it's undignified because I'm not a human. I feel like I've failed. So every time somebody gives me a gift, a part of me feels ashamed. But that emotional feeling is an echo of a real existential feeling. Where if I don't invite God in, then I lose my existence as he enters. Either he enters and I stop existing, or he doesn't enter and I don't exist. But there's no state in which I can maintain existence with a being thinking me into existence that doesn't fill me up at some point. And therefore free will is the key. So we're placed, each soul, if you like, gets a little entry point for a few decades in this world where our free will is manifesting being partners with God in the world. Here's what you do, here's the instructions, here's what it means to choose God, here's the practical ramification. But some of that's intuitive. Every human being walking planet Earth has some instincts around what God consciousness would be like, even if they don't know how to articulate it that way, which is why a Noahide law can be for all of humanity. Most of it's instinctive, right? Or at least instinctively accessible in principle, a certain level of innate morality, if you like, or spirituality. But then, as a Jewish people, we have a specific Torah that we have to do to help generate an intensification of light for the rest of the world. And that's our pathway to that, and so on. So that's the activation of the particular direction the free will choice is going. But the philosophical principle is it's the free will choice to invite God in. Or again, let's bring that down to simple psychological choice with Rosh Hashanah coming up. Do I want to be the center of reality and I tell God what I'd like God to do, but ultimately the world's about me, in which case most of my life won't really be about God? Or is God the center of reality and I'm here to be a vessel for God's light and I'm inviting God to take me over, if you like, and fill me with the knowledge and wisdom of how I can be a conduit for God's light in the world? That's the core of the free will choice. And that's why the Gemara can say, you're learning Ksubas, you'll soon be there, Hakol bidei shamayim chutz miyirah shamayim, everything is in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven. The word yirah, fear, is related to the word re'iyah, of perception of reality. I'm not saying grammatically, but conceptually. And everything is in the hands of heaven except where we prioritize heaven itself. Everything's in God's hands except he gives us the bit of how much we direct our life to him, invite him in, as it were, and how much we make it about ourselves. If that answers the question. What was our third? I've forgotten now the list that we started with. It was, who's going to remember what the next one was? We had, was it your question?
The authenticity and the authorship of the Zohar. And the relevance of it.
Okay, very good question. So the authenticity of the Zohar, as Zohar, for those who are not aware, is the primary text used as a primary source text for Kabbalistic knowledge. And it was not known about as a specific text, or at least not written about, I should say, a specific text, till Rav Moshe de Leon famously published it in the 13th century. And of course that aroused the suspicion that it's a forgery, or meaning he claimed that he's publishing the teachings that go back to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Right? Now, some people were very suspicious relatively early on. There's a whole story. Did his wife say that he'd in fact written it? There's a whole discussion of the that's not so well known. There's some very interesting debates about this, okay, about the authenticity of the Zohar. Is it all Rav Shimon Bar Yochai? Is it all Rav Moshe de Leon? Is it something in between? The Chasam Sofer seems to come out, and he's certainly not the only view on this, he seems to come out that it's likely that the core of it is from Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, but not all of it, right? Meaning, let's go back to the Gemara and the Midrashim. We have this tradition, I mean, the Gemara itself tells us that Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, drew the students around him as he was dying and leaving the world and made a big circle, or gave out teachings, and his teachings, by tradition, they're on Lag BaOmer, and we know there was a thing called, we know in Tanakh there's something called Messianic. But let's talk about what even a skeptic has to agree. Tanakh has chapters of intense revelation. Yeshayahu Hanavi has one in the 6th chapter of Isaiah. Yechezkel starts with one, which shocks him because it's happening in exile. He's seeing, and it's called Ma'aseh Merkava, the work of the chariot. They see a lot of imagery, angels. Our Kedusha on a daily basis is quoting the lines that they see and hear in these intense visions. They seem to have this almost anthropomorphic representations. They get deeper and deeper into the revelation. There's some kind of throne, and there's some kind of image, and there's something going on over there that doesn't cohere with the general approach throughout Tanakh that God is invisible, doesn't seem to belong in any space, doesn't sit in a throne in the temple. And here they're seeing visions that seem to be different to that. And the Gemara says, yes, this is called Ma'aseh Merkava, the work of the chariot. You cannot teach it in public because you need to understand what it's really. And the Gemara teaches what's really going on. The Gemara teaches how to get there. The Gemara says this is how it's in Chagiga. How do you transmit Ma'aseh Merkava, the work of the chariot? And it tells us about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. How would it go? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi would turn to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, his teacher, and say to him, Rabbi, can you teach us Ma'aseh Merkava, the work of the chariot? And what's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai reply? You know I can't teach you the work of the chariot. So he says, okay, fine. Can I give you Roshei Prokim, the heads of chapters? Can I give you? Right, which is, of course, introductory meaning to say, I'd like to now see if I'm there. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai hears him, immediately dismounts. They both dismounted, and there's incredible imagery of what was going on. It's some kind of mystical ascent and powerful thing. And after Rav Yeshua finishes talking, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, praised him and kissed him, and that's how it was taught. What's that mean? Of course, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had been teaching him and teaching him and teaching him. But it's like, I think Rabbi Tatz used this analogy once. It's like you take them to the edge of the mountain, but the person has to fall in. Partly for the reason I explained last week when we spoke about why the Kabbalistic dimension is called Soid, or the secret level. There's a level so deep that words don't really carry you there. And the student can have gone on the journey with the master, and then depending on their own refinement and their own development, they can now get beyond where the words go, and two people in the same space can understand each other. There are those who didn't. Even I think it's Ben Zoyma, who's incredibly great. He appears in the Mishnah. Rav Yochanan says he's at, I forget which one it says. It says he's bachutz, he's outside. He hasn't understood it yet. So, and this how it was transmitted. And the Rambam actually, amazingly, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, says about himself in the introduction to the third section, the tradition's been lost in his part of the world. For whatever reason, it was not there. It seems to have not been there. At some point, it was lost in North Africa, possibly because they stopped teaching it in the Surah Yeshiva, right? One of the two great Babylonian yeshivas. The Gemara says Rav Yosef stopped transmitting it. The question if the early Gaonim had it or not, what they had also, but it's likely that in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, it carried on. First of all, in Eretz Yisrael, even through the Gaonic period, there was much more interest in things like Hebrew grammar, poetry, medrash, and mystical texts that we know existed there, like the Sefer Bahir, the Heichalos. There's definitely Kabbalistic literature. So everyone agrees there's Merkava. Everyone agrees there was transmission of this Merkava through Rav Shimon Bar Yochai and others, but all the way down through the Amoraic period, at least to Rav Yosef. Likely it continued uninterrupted in Israel. Everyone agrees that we have ancient midrashim that are Kabbalistic, and that definitely writings are continuing through the Gaonic period. No question about that. And then there seems to be bubbling stuff happening in Europe. There's something called Hasidei Ashkenaz. What were they doing? What texts were they using? We don't know, but we know they were doing something. And that seems to arc through the, if you want to call it Golus Edom, the European exile, but it seems that at some point it wasn't as active in the exile in the Muslim worlds, right? Which is where Rav Saadia Gaon is writing, or the Rambam. Now, there are those who claim the Rambam really had Kabbalah, and the Moreh Nevuchim is secretly like Kabbalah. It's not as crazy as that sounds. The Rambam is very clear himself, at least if you take him literally, that he didn't. But people are always suspicious about anything the Rambam says. It's like, he can say, I'm not doing this, and yeah, maybe he is. But it's not as crazy as it sounds, because so much of what he says is parallel to things in Kabbalah, right? So I have a great rabbi who taught me once, name's Moshe Stav. He said he doesn't think the Rambam had Kabbalah, but he thinks that because he learned the Pshat, the straightforward levels, so accurately, everything, the deeper levels just mirror the more superficial levels. Now then the Zohar turns up, and the Zohar itself is interesting. Now, critics of the Zohar, and they abound, the modern version, let's now move away from the debate around this time. It was quite rapidly accepted by most rabbis in Spain as authentic. As I say, the Chassam Sofer said that's true about its core teachings, but it's clearly being embellished. Now, amongst other things, there's some Spanish words in there, so at least some of the words have to have been added in later on, and there's some of the rabbis who are teaching it seem to be from later periods, or they could debate that. So it seems that it's very reasonable, at least according to Chasam Sofer, that it's layered and its core teachings might go back to Shem Bayachai, and there may be a lot more added. There was a lot of research done in the early 20th century by academics, generally quite skeptical about the Zohar, and also in the 19th century. There was a lot in the Haskalah, where they brought a lot of arguments against its authenticity from things like the language. There was a lot of Gershom Shalom famously wrote, there's loads of words in the Zohar that seem to be a bad job of trying to patch together different Aramaics, and somebody didn't know what they're doing. It was an amateur job. There's actually been a research project in University College London by a bunch of researchers, not believers in God or Kabbalah or anything. I mean, I don't know what they believe. I'm not sure. I shouldn't say profess to know. But I don't believe they're Orthodox Jews for the most part. And they have studied the language of the Zohar and reached a different conclusion. Their conclusion is that now that we have a lot more access to different Aramaic texts down different ages, the Zohar's Aramaic is actually an authentic Aramaic, maybe a poetic writing of it, but it's a clearly authentic Aramaic. Words people thought were not authentic Aramaic words are, grammatical forms they thought actually are, and it roughly seems to be about a 7th or 8th century Palestinian Aramaic, that's what academics would call it, right? Meaning the Aramaic of the time just post-Chazal of the Gaonic era, where, by the way, a lot of Chazal Midrashim are being canonized and written, right? So it's similar to some of the, let's say, Targum Yonasan and things like that, which again are probably Targum Yonasan particularly is probably older, but certain things are being committed to writing. So what is not implausible at all is that something's being transmitted. It takes a written form, let's say 100, 200 years after the Gemara, and then now, one of two things has to happen. How does Rav Moshe de Leon get access to this Aramaic that's not really being spoken or taught much in Europe at that time in that way? We don't see Rishonim write that way, for example. So either you'll have to say they're real texts that he had, and as he says, I'm just publishing them now. And there were small groups that had them through, and here I am. Right? That, if you wanted to be a skeptical academic, you'd probably have to say that there must have been a set of other texts that he'd learned his Aramaic from that's probably talking about mystical things that we don't have, and that's one way or another you're going to have to deal with the fact there's probably a set of texts being transmitted quietly that nobody has a published version of that's speaking about these things in that Aramaic that either he's then publishing or he may be editing and embellishing a bit, or he's using all of them, and there's so much literature you can write this, but you're getting very close to a much more the type of story we would say as Orthodox traditionalists. Now, how critical is the Zohar? And I'll tell you one other thing is very important as well. The Zohar itself contains different levels. It's not one text, it's a set of texts. The most famous, most kind of what you normally call the Zohar is the commentary on the Torah. But there's other pieces that appear at various points. There's the Tikkunei Zohar, there's the Idra Rabbah, Idra Zutta, the Tafra de Tzniasa. And three of them are much, again, where you get the real anthropomorphic things that are essentially elaborating on the Maaseh Merkava, the chariot chapters of Tanakh. And those three, it seems that Rav Moshe de Leon himself struggled to understand them. Some even claim that things in the Zohar contradicted his own personal teachings, which again adds credence to the view that he himself, if he embellished, added bits on, fine, but the core teachings he might have not touched, right? Or again, would add. I'm talking purely from an academic perspective. Again, one should also know Rav Moshe de Leon does write other works that he attributes to people, and this raises suspicion about him, right? But he's also a Kabbalist of his own, and sees this contradiction with the Zohar in him. But most importantly, he didn't understand all of the Zohar. Those very esoteric pieces, he does not seem to have had a good understanding himself. And the Ramak comes along, Rav Moshe Cordovero, and starts to give a very sophisticated interpretation of them. But it's really the Arizal, when he introduces what's called Parat Sufim, that suddenly all makes sense, right? And almost everyone today who studies Zohar studies it assuming the Arizal. The Vilna Gaon argues on the Arizal a few important details, but the basic structure of what the Arizal does fits so well and makes the Zohar seem to make a lot of sense in areas where it seemed very esoteric, that today there are not enormous numbers of people who would disagree that the best way to understand the Zohar is the Arizal. But if you've got something kind of that fits like a glove, then it starts to raise a suspicion that the person you think that this really was a tradition that Moshe de Leon himself didn't fully understand. So almost every, I'd say the vast majority of Orthodox Jews, and certainly almost all Gedolei Yisrael, add a drop of a caveat, believe in some degree or another of the authenticity of the Zohar, right? Now let's go to those who, I'm talking within Gedolei Yisrael, who might have moved towards the other side of it, at least significant parts, and not originally from Rosh Hashanah, but let's take the Chasam Sofer, let's take the Rav Yaakov Emden, I think even stronger. Rav Yaakov Emden is very interesting that he, even though he seems to raise some questions about it, he seems to use a lot of the Arizal himself, right? Meaning, the question is it a Rishon or is it Chazal? That's really the question. And even if it's a Rishon, where did that Rishon get these ideas from? Let's suppose in a worst case scenario, Moshe Rabbeinu made this all up. Where did he get these ideas from? They're like out the blue. They don't neatly, they cohere with things in Torah, but they're such radically different ways of talking about things. Somebody, he just made, it's very strange to believe someone would make something up out the blue, so far, removed from because why would you expect anybody to take it on? It's like, why would you expect it to be popular if it's so crazy? It's almost inconceivable, even from a secular perspective, that he would not have been working in some kind of ecosystem relatively familiar, where the gap between his ideas and published ideas are not as far apart as they appear, that he would have expected people to take it seriously as a work of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Because nothing in Chazal writes in that language, in those frames, in those words. I mean, he would have, if it was really a bolt out of the blue, it should have just been, everyone would have just frowned and gone, this is crazy. We also know very well from the Ramban himself, clearly there was an enormous Kabbalistic tradition, because again and again in the Torah he refers to the Derech HaEmes, the way of truth, as if there's a group of people reading it who will know what he's talking about. And we know at least 2 generations in the whole Raived's world in Provence, that there's clearly a universe going on of unpublished material that is very prevalent in at least 1,000 years ago, at least, that presumably, again, has a long oral tale. So I'm saying, even if you try to be as secular as you want to be, you're going to struggle to really deny there isn't an authentic mystical tradition somewhere floating around, at least in the European Ashkenazic world, that's bubbling up signs of it all over the place, that allows for this very radical text to enter the world, that's coherent with so many of these ideas that schools from the Ramban school could turn around and go, yeah, this must be the thing, this is it, right? Because it works so well with our oral traditions that we got around it, that you're going to be looking at something that in a worst case scenario is expressing a much, much, much older Masorah, running all the way back to things like the Echolos, Midrashim and so on. Now, very practically, what's the practical ramification of the Zohar? The official, different poskim in the Shulchan Aruch come up with different rules for it. The general rule of the Mechaber himself and the Ramah seems to be that we will never use the Zohar against the Gemara in Halacha, because we are bound legally to follow the Halacha, just like Rav Shimon Bar Yochai alive may have been the greatest teacher of esoteric, mystical, deeper dimensions, but we don't paskin him in Halacha very often, right? We do sometimes, but he's like, if the Sanhedrin was able to function fully in his time, they'd have sat around the table and voted. And the fact that he may have certain access to something, that doesn't get the halacha like him. So the halacha doesn't go like the Zohar. Where people will use it now is, what happens if we don't have a clear hachra, we can't clearly decide within the Gemara, can we use the Zohar to help us tilt? Or can individuals use the Zohar as a personal closeness to God act when it's not forbidden in halacha? These are the sorts of times when you might use it. And then there's different rules, and the Magen Avraham will use more of the Arizal's Torahs. The Vilna Gaon holds the Arizal's like a Rishon, not massively different halacha from it. So now the question arises, if you've got this whole dimension of Torah, and its primary purpose is not halachic, right? What is it? Now, I should also point out, Hasidim take it very differently to Litvaks, right? So, for example, there's many examples of this, right? Hasidim, let's take mainstream Ashkenaz, Tefillin, Chol HaMoed. The Zohar is very, very clear, you shouldn't be wearing Tefillin, Chol HaMoed. Ashkenazim generally have the custom to wear Tefillin, Chol HaMoed, so the Yekas still to this day will wear Tefillin, Chol HaMoed. The Vilna Gaon happened to paskin this one not to. How much was that because of the Zohar? How much is that because how he learned through the Rishonim? Ultimately, paskin not to. So here in Israel, many Ashkenazim don't eat as well. Beard, shaving, things like this, right? In halacha, it seems you could justify shaving. You can't put a razor to, right? Hasidim will generally, the Zohar talks about the dikna, the holiness of the beard, and so on. So you have different divisions as to how much the Zohar is talking externally and how much when it says something, it's referring to the inner spirit, the soul level. You've got to make sure your soul is unshaven, it's beard. How much does that have to carry through to the physical? Okay, that's now where you'll start to get different views and different opinions. But in terms of mainstream actual halacha, almost, I think everybody would agree that you can't change something that's clearly paskined in a Gemara in the usual halachic method because of something you see in the Zohar. They famously asked the Vilna Gaon, they write about this in the back of some printed versions of the Nefesh HaChaim, where Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin asked about Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, which seemed to work with the Zohar better, right? And again, you can immediately see what's going on. The order of the parashiyos, Bipnimius, in the inner worlds could be different because the order in which you serve Hashem in the outer world might then be mirrored down into a different order in the outer world, and you can see you could keep both. And anyway, so the Chaim Volozhin asked, and there, by the way, Shulchan Aruch, you will see, because Rabbeinu Tam was in the out-revealed world and said it now becomes a part of the halachic debate. So Hasidim will often wear Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, because since it's in the debate sphere, now we can, but usually they'll wear Rashi as well. You don't wear just Rabbeinu Tam. So the Vilna Gaon will ask why he doesn't. Why not be Mahada and do a Chumrah, at least privately? Chumras you don't generally try and do too publicly unless the whole Kehillah does it. But privately at least. And he told Reb Chaim Volozhin, if you want to follow every single shit, you'll be wearing like dozens of tefillin. And then he showed Reb Chaim Volozhin, Reb Chaim writes this, or so it's quoted in his name, how, in fact, if you look carefully, every time there's a contradiction between halacha and the Zohar, you can reconcile them. They're not really contradiction. You just need to know how to read them both correctly. And Reb Chaim says about that the Vilna Gaon showed him and he was blown away. Now he doesn't reveal what the answer is there.